unveiling the altars. And I think sometimes we forget about an altar is probably more valuable to a saved person than it is somebody that's unsaved. Finding an altar but so many times in our life, the altars are the things that get covered up and are hidden. And it's the things that get clouded and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. In the Old Testament, it was kind of clear. Time and time again, you've seen something, but in seeing it, I don't know that it's ever thought about as you read through there. And it's mentioned over 27 times in the Old Testament it happens. And it's found in over 14 books, different books of the Old Testament. So out of the 39 books, it's almost in over a third of them. And if you go back through, and it's called different things in different versions. It's called a grove in one version. It's called an Asherah in another version. It's called a group of trees in another version. It's called whatever you want to refer to these groves as. It's usually a group of trees that usually worshipers plant on high places, because throughout the Old Testament, altars was built on a high place or a high hill or somewhere where it was very visible to see an altar. They did it for a couple of reasons. For one, you could visibly see it, and another one was it was placed in a place of honor or precedence or high stature, or someplace it was always looking down on it. Another reason is because people could look up during a sacrifice and they could see these altars and they could see the sacrifice being performed. So what happens throughout the Old Testament, and we're going to jump into the New Testament in just a minute, but what happens throughout the Old Testament, anytime the children of Israel start backsliding, one of the first things that they do in Baal worship is they plant a grove, or they plant a group of trees. And they always do it in a strategic location. They always do it around the altar. You'll always see the grove of trees planted in front of an altar. Why do you do that? Because you're hiding the place of sacrifice, and you're covering up the place of an altar, and you're obscuring it to where pretty soon that grove of trees, anybody ever been around groves of trees, pretty soon they can't keep multiplying and multiplying. I don't know if it happens around your house, but if you have one maple tree, it turns into 100 maple trees, because every time the 10,000 seeds fall into the ground, you have little bitty shoots of maple trees or oaks or something that comes up out of the ground, right? Cedar trees around our house. But you have all these little trees, and pretty soon they pretty much take over the place and cover up what used to be there. And you'll always find out if something is important because you'll take care of it. You'll trim around it. You'll manicure it. You'll make sure that it looks nice. And the things that you don't care about tend to get forgot about, left out, get pushed to the backside. And Tiffany always has a saying. She says, if you love something, you will find time to do it. If you love something, you'll always find time to do it. That goes for all of our hobbies, all of our extracurricular activities, our time spent with the Word of God, time spent with Christ Himself in prayer, time spent in the house of God, time spent with other people, friends, family, relatives, whatever you want to put importance on, you will find time to get that done. It's kind of like the IRS finding time for you to pay taxes. They would love that, and they will find time for you to give to them. Whether you find time for them, they will find time for you. And so, we are awake this morning. So we're going to go to the book of Judges. The book of Judges. Here's one example of some 27 that I found in the Old Testament. But here's one. It's one that's glaring to me because this is one instance that they take an absolute hatred or discord for this grove. So in Judges chapter 6, we're going to start out at verse 25. You know, it's the call of Gideon is in chapter 6. But we get caught up in the call of Gideon. We get caught up with the call of him being behind a winepress. We get caught up with the story of the fleece. We get caught up with the story about his military crusades with not enough people. You ever notice sometimes God strips people away from us because we have too many? Can I say sometimes he does it with people that's around us that we lean on, that he strips away from us, even godly people, so that we will lean on Christ? If we put a person in between Christ and us, sometimes God removes that person so that we will have an utter dependence upon him. My mom said it best one time when she said, my mom and my dad were both backslidden throughout the 80s and 90s. And she told me that the Lord spoke to her that she would have to get saved before my dad because she depended on him for so many years. And she leaned on him. And she said, that's exactly the way it played out. My mom, in our family, I got saved first, then my mom, then my brother, and then my dad. Is kind of the order that it went in over about 18 months to 2 years there. But she, sure enough, did get saved before my dad, and I thought, and all of them was unique instance. Mine was probably the only, I don't know if there is such a thing as normal, but I was actually saved in a church. My mom got saved in a car. My dad got saved at home, and my brother got saved in a jail cell. So it's interesting where God will work. And if we try to put him in a box that he has to draw him in this particular order, he will show you that he can do anything he wants to do. Gideon says, I needed this many people to go attack the Midianites. So God strips them all away from him and says, look, you can do it with nobody if I choose that. So if we think about why did you say that? Because a lot of times we have it in our mind, certain things have to occupy or take place before we can do certain things. But can I tell you, if we have our heart right with the Lord, that all we need is him. When he calls and he directs, we don't need anything else but him. But what we do need is for our heart to be right. And what we do need is for our focus to be correct. And what we do need is to have the mindset that God can do anything. And if that's really true, we can read this. Here in verse 25, let's start out here. That night the Lord said to him, the Lord is talking to Gideon, take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah, or the grove of trees, that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here, with the stones lay in due order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah, or the grove, that you cut down. So Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. Lord Jesus, God, help us to understand your word. God, help us to highlight, God, what you want, Lord Jesus, God, out of your word. And Lord, help us to apply it to our life, Lord. And God, I thank you, Lord, so much, Lord, in Jesus' name, for what you're going to give your people today, Lord. And we thank you. All right, so let's jump into the word here. Let's jump back in verse 25, and then we're going to go forward with that, and we're going to fall in line with this word, and we're going to talk a little bit about this grove of trees, of how it stood in the way of them being able to see the altar. And so many times, you're going to hear me say this over and over again, because I believe it. Whatever will keep you out of an altar will keep you out of heaven. Let me say that one more time. Whatever will stand between you and an altar will keep you out of heaven. Why do I say that? Because if you have unforgiveness in your heart for any reason, it will keep you away from God, and it will separate you. And what it will do is, if you allow it to, it will plant a seed that will start in to separate you from God, and that seed will multiply and grow. The same way that it talks about the saints of God, if they fall into the ground and die, God uses it as a parable in the New Testament, and He uses it as a grain or wheat grain, and it says, if a wheat grain remain in a barn or remains alive, right, it will remain a single seed. But if that single seed falls into the ground and dies, then it will become a multitude of seeds. And I don't know how many of you have seen a grain of wheat. Has anybody ever picked a grain of wheat? It's interesting. I wish I had one here today. But that single grain that fell into the ground and died and was planted and was watered and cultivated and grew up, it flourishes into a wonderful plant. And that plant, at the head of it, will have several, probably 30 or 40 pieces of grain. That one produces 30 or 40 fold to what that one was. And so if you multiply and take that one plant, right, and put all of those 30 seeds in the ground, and they grow up, you'll have 900 out of that plant. That 900 turns into 2,700 in three things from one seed in 3 generations. You can see that the multiplication is amazing when we talk about what it means to serve Christ, to go and witness to a single person, and what that person can turn into, and what that person can do, and what effect that we can have. We're all the time looking about return on investment. We're all the time looking about what kind of impacts we can have. We're all the time looking about what difference we can make to a person, what difference we can make in the world. And really, if we look at it, if we will start just impacting the people around us, and witnessing to the people that we come in contact with, it's amazing to see what God can do in just as simple as 2 or 3 generations there. You could see 2,700 people come to Christ really easy, just with 30 people, just winning 30 people to the Lord in your lifetime. Really, 30 people isn't even one a year for the years that you spend on the earth. Think about that. It's really not that hard. It's not that many. And yet you could see 2,700 people in just as little as 3 generations. It wouldn't take very long for us to turn the country around for Christ if we would start winning a person a year. Think about that. Think about that. If every Christian, they say that only 4% of America is Christian, but even if they were, 4% could win 30 people. Think about that. 4% now is multiplied by 30, right? You get to 100% of America in a hurry, right? And we can take the country back one person at a time. But we're talking about altars. So how do we get to that manifold blessing? Or how do we get to seeing that crop come in? And how do we see all of those people get saved? And how do we do that? Well, first we have to make sure our life is right. Right? We want to be led by the Spirit. And to be led by the Spirit, we have to hear His voice. So to hear His voice, we got to get ourselves out of the way. Gideon, one of the main things that he did, and he wasn't the bravest of people. Matter of fact, you see his weakness all through the book. So if we're looking for a hero, Gideon is not the man. Gideon kind of reminds us of ourselves, right? Where we get afraid and we show weakness. But what we see out of Gideon's life is not the superhero, but what we find is an obedience to God, and God uses that obedience. But first, Gideon has to get Gideon out of the way. That's the important lesson that we learn from this book. And so how do we do that? So first thing he does is he sees a grove of trees, and he sees the altar that has been disgraced, or an altar that was sacrificed Baal's offerings on, and that was his father. His father was the leading man in the city, and his father was the one that was bringing this curse to the city. And so before God did anything, he was going to deal with the priesthood. He was going to deal with the sacrifices that was being made to false idols. But first he was doing, and all along this group of trees, this Asherim, or this grove was in front of there. And we see it again in Hezekiah's day. If we would flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 31 through 33, we would see Hezekiah do the exact same thing. And all they did was plant a grove of trees around the altar where they couldn't get to the altar anymore. That grove of trees was separating the people from the altar. That grove of trees was hiding or obscuring the altar. So no longer did people think about that they needed an altar. No longer did they think about they needed a sacrifice. No longer did they think about that I've done wrong or something is wrong. When you look upon an altar, it's not a beautiful thing. An altar is a place of death. An altar is a place of dying. It's of bloodshed. It's not pretty by any stretch of the imagination. Think about it in this century. It would have been covered in bloodstains for the many animals that had to die on that particular altar to keep people in a right attitude towards God or a right standing with the Lord. It would have been a terrible thing. Can I tell you, Calvary wasn't a beautiful thing where Christ had to suffer. It was a beautiful offering and a beautiful thing that he done. But the act was a gruesome act. Crucifixion's not a beautiful thing. That's why they did it. The Romans wasn't known for being merciful or creating death penalties that said, I'd like to sign up for that vacation. That's the way I would like to die. If I'm being executed, please let me choose that. And I have to think that Christ chose that because he wanted to depict how much he loved humanity. And yet Christ chose that. It was foretold of him because of how much that he loved it, right? It's way back when Moses had the serpent, put it on a pole, and they looked to the serpent for their transgression and the bites. Christ references that statue or that pole and says, so was the serpent that they held up in the wilderness, so will the Son of Man be lifted up. And he references it in the future. But here we find this grove of trees and we find Gideon. And the Lord deals with Gideon and he says, go ahead and take your father's bull, which is kind of funny, right? Can you imagine that? Dad wakes up, my grove of trees is cut down, my altar's laid waste, my livestock's gone, by the way, and you barbecued my bull with my trees in front of my altar. That's a good son. Can you imagine that? Your dad was probably not the happiest with you that day. And one night you undid a lot of his teachings for that whole time. But in doing so, the God tells him, he said, go down, pull down the altar of Baal that your father has built. Go and pull it down that your father has built. And cut down that grove of trees that's beside it. Make sure that the people can see what you've done. You understand? He's unveiling the altar. You understand? He's uncovering what they covered up. And he's making it plain for them people to see. And the first thing, I love this, and so when he goes and takes those trees and he rebuilds an altar for God, because they don't use the desecrated altar. Understand that. That he goes and he rebuilds an altar for God, and he offers a sacrifice with the wood that he cut down, or that grove of trees that he cut down, and he offers a sacrifice for the transgression of the people in the town. Verse 28, I didn't read it, but I put it in here. On verse 28, it says, when the men of that town rose up early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it, or the grove of trees beside it, was cut down. And the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. Verse 29, I didn't read. And when they said to one another, who has done this thing? And after they have searched and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing. And these men of the town were so enraged, because the first thing when they looked up, they were looking up at the hillside. The trees have been cut down, smoke is coming up, and the bull has been offered. And they said, who tore down the altars of Baal? Who desecrated the altars of Baal? Who did this thing? And they said, oh, it was Gideon, son of Joash, did this. He's the one that desecrated it. And they go out to kill him. And the dad looks at him and says, why don't Baal contend for Baal? If Baal is a god, let Baal strike him down. You say, well, he's not a god. He can't do anything. That's exactly right. But in the Old Testament, when they mess with gods, when they mess with the ark of God, and they take the ark of God and they put it in the house of Dagon, it doesn't go the same way. God doesn't need anybody to fight for him when he cuts off the hands and the feet and the head of Dagon in his house by himself. And they're stricken with a plague. And they said, make sure the ark of God leaves this place before we're all killed. They were quick to send the ark of God back home, and there wasn't an Israelite in the country to fight for God. See, God doesn't need anybody to help him out. You got to understand that. As we are people of God, God doesn't need us. He chooses to use us. That's the beautiful thing about him, right? That we get to be used by God. And as we fall in line with him, he uses us to be his arms and feet, to do wonderful things and encourage people and lift them up. We got a hurricane coming, and we prayed for them this morning, and we need to continue to pray for those people. The people in Afghanistan, there's been millions of dollars raised up out of our country to send over there to help humanitarian aid and bring people out of harm's way. There've been millions of dollars done that way. Why? Because we can show that we are the hands and feet of God. There'll be millions of bottles of water. There'll be millions of supplies. There'll be millions of people that'll go out and hand out food and water. Even the Tide Company goes and they have multiple trucks that roll down there to wash people's clothes. Why? Why do they do that humanitarian aid? Because it shows the hands and feet of Jesus in a real and tangible way. They can see Jesus working. And when they're handing out food and supplies and they realize somebody somewhere has packed that truck, that 18-wheeler that rolled down there. There was some Christian that got in that driver's seat, drove in harm's way to the middle of a storm so that they could show Christ's love to those people. And those groves are cut down and the altars are seen. And people are shown the love of Christ. And an opportunity is given for them to come to the Lord because they've seen Christ's work. Here Gideon cut it down so people could see the work of God and what was going on. Why is that important? Because he's getting ready to go on some of the greatest military campaigns that Israel has seen in this time period. And he's going to do it with not enough people, not enough armies, and not even the right people. Matter of fact, God chose the people that didn't fit in to go. And when they had 300, they started off with thousands, and God says, you've got too many. And he cuts it down to hundreds, and he says, you still have too many. And I'm telling you, if I'm getting ready to go into a battle, I think maybe I needed more. I sure wouldn't be trying to shoo them off and say, you need to go away. It doesn't make any sense. You ever notice sometimes when God uses us, it doesn't make any sense? But God's trying to show how good He is. He says, you don't need all those people. In one instance, God fights the battle for them, sends the king away, and his own sons kill him in his own country. When God is doing something, we don't have to fight the battles a lot of times. The problem is we try to fight the battles and get in God's way until we step back and get away and say, God, okay, it's yours. And then it takes care of itself because God's in it, right? But sometimes it's hard to pull away, right? Sometimes hard to take our own fingers out of it. But when they revealed this altar and God fixes the altar, then God changes the heart. But until we're willing to lay ourselves down at an altar, He can't change the heart. He can't fix it because we won't allow Him to. But if we don't uncover the altars in our own life, in our own homes, in our own situation, and we're all the time looking for somebody else or some other fault. I wrote down a lot of other scriptures this morning. I don't feel really led to go there this morning, but I'll share one with you because we talked about it before I left. Actually, I'll share two about our brother's keeper that's in Genesis. And Cain and Abel got in trouble. And Cain looked and told God, he said, am I my brother's keeper? It was a question because he had already killed him. And he knew where he was. But he said, am I my brother's keeper? Over in the book of Proverbs, Solomon says, he has a statement that says, iron sharpeneth iron. In other words, I am my brother's keeper. I am responsible in helping my brother, my sister in the Lord. One thing that we don't do enough in the Christian body is to be able to help somebody over a hump that they're struggling with. And I don't mean point out every fault in everybody else. I mean to come alongside of somebody and help them through a tough time. Why don't we do that? Because it's hard, it's messy, and it's complicated. And injecting yourself into somebody else's life until the problems get fixed is hard. Watching somebody struggle, especially if it's something that you have been involved with and have came through on the other side, and we say this with love, you forgot about your own struggle and how hard it was for you, and you say, why don't you just do this? And you forget about the years it took you to get to this. Right? Because sometimes that journey that you did went through the whole alphabet from A all the way to Z. And you see the person somewhere around M or N. And you say, why don't you just go to Z? But they don't see it just like you didn't see it. And you have to love that person through the last half of that alphabet. Right? And you're willing to walk alongside of them through that journey and through that process? Even if they don't see it and you're pointing it out to them along the way? It's aggravating, isn't it? You can also see where God was with you. It's aggravating, isn't it? Because He knew the way. And sometimes we don't listen. We cover up that altar. And you say, but all you need to do is go to the altar and you could fix that. They don't see it. Just the same way we don't see it sometimes. Just like the same way that we're covering is the same time we're telling them to unveil that altar, we're piling stuff on top of ours so you can't see it. Right? Instead of uncovering our own altar. Instead of uncovering our own place that we need help in, that we're struggling in, the areas that we need God, right? Next week we're going to talk about the purpose of an altar. We're going to continue this series in uncovering altars on the purpose of an altar. Because I love the Christian church in America. But we've convinced ourselves that an altar is for just unsaved people. We have convinced ourselves in America that altars are only for unsaved people. And we've done something in the American church as a whole, as we have stripped out altars out of churches. We have stripped them out. And I'm not talking about just the furniture. But we've stripped the idea of altars away because it represents death and sacrifice. But until we're willing to die, we can never live. Before we're willing to die, we can never live. And sometimes it has to happen multiple times in our life. And we have to crucify this body, this flesh, multiple times. Because that old man comes back to life. Especially if you spend time away from God, away from His Word, and away from prayer, and away from God's people, and away from fellowship with God's people, that old life starts to become alive again. Old habits find their way back. You say, that's not theologically sound. I'm telling you, that's life. Most of us live that. You can find it as a biblical pattern all throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament, because if it was, they'd only had to chop these groves down one time, but you find it 27 times. And 27 times out of 39 books is a lot. Right? There's only 12 books it's not in. And one of them is Job, and that's because there wasn't an altar in Job's life. There wasn't sacrifices in Job's life or in Job's book because he predates when they had the Levitical priesthood. So one of them it can't be in because he predates it. So if you kick that one out, now you're down to 11. And yes, you do find it in Genesis. They didn't wait to plant that grove and to hide those altars. They didn't wait. Find it in the book of Genesis. So, what makes you think in our life that even when we first start out as Christians, we don't start out trying to cover up those altars? And when we leave that altar, that's when we find ourselves in trouble. I said it in the beginning of this. Whatever will keep you out of an altar will keep you out of heaven, because that's the wedge. That's the wedge that will drive between you and God, and that will get greater and greater. Can I tell you, it never gets better? Say time heals all wounds. That doesn't work in that instance. The only way to fix that is come back to an altar, sacrifice that, and kill it, and give it to God. That's the only way that works. That's the only way that works. How does that apply to our own life? Let's talk about the marriage real quick before we close. You have a fight year one in your marriage. You never address it, never fix it. Does year 10, does that go away? No, it raises up its head every so often. Can I say it raises up its head every so often? Usually in the most inconvenient times. Can I say the only way to fix that is to go back to that event, get forgiveness from that person, and go back to the original point and kill it there? Because if you're just dealing with symptoms for the rest of your marriage, but you'll never be treating the problem. Make sense for married people? Because if you don't deal with the source, you'll just deal with symptoms. As Christians, if we don't go back to an altar and we just cover it up with words, we're not dealing with the source. We're just trying to help symptoms. We just change clothes and we just look nicer, and we'll change our vocabulary and people will think that we're right. And we'll change the places that we go so people won't suspect what's going on in our homes or going on in our life underneath. But until we deal with the root of the problem and get back to an altar, the rest of that stuff is just planting trees in front, making the facade look good. But are we dealing with the source? So Christ sees a problem. Christ sees a problem way back in the book of Genesis, in the garden, and a plan is made. And the plan is with a tree. And the plan is not to cover up with a grove, but the plan is Calvary. The plan is Calvary. The plan is a sacrifice, one sacrifice for all. And one is good to cover all. And if we're sitting out there today and we're saying, you know what, I've created trees and groves and planted stuff in front so you couldn't see the sacrifice, so you couldn't see the cross, so you couldn't see, and I don't think about it anymore. And I've created a hedge or a circumstance where I don't find that place anymore because it's painful or it's too much for me to bear. Then this morning's a perfect time to uncover that, bring it to an altar, and give it to God.